The cafeteria fell silent. 500 students at one of America's most elite private academies watched in stunned disbelief as milk dripped from the new girl's uniform onto the marble floor. Tyler Brooks stood over her, that trademark smirk playing on his lips, the same expression that had terrorized countless students before her. Son of a billionaire real estate mogul, captain of the football team, untouchable, or so he thought. What Tyler didn't know, what none of them knew, was that he had just made the gravest mistake of his privileged young life. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous. Sometimes, the girl who walks through your halls in a simple blazer while everyone else wears designer labels isn't poor. She simply doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. Sometimes, true power doesn't announce itself with expensive cars or famous last names. It whispers. And when Tyler Brooks knocked over Zara Kane's lunch tray that September afternoon, when he tried to humiliate her in front of the entire school, he had no idea he was attacking someone whose father could destroy his family's empire with a single phone call. He couldn't have imagined that this calm, composed young woman who simply stood up and walked away without shedding a tear came from a family that made his wealth look like pocket change. In the world of predators and prey, Tyler had always been the hunter, but hunters should know one critical rule: never corner something if you don't know what it is. Because that quiet girl eating alone in the corner, that new student who doesn't seem to know the social rules, sometimes they're not prey at all. Sometimes they're the apex predator, and you've just given them a reason to bare their teeth. This is the story of what happens when a bully targets the wrong person and learns that real power never needs to raise its voice. At Hillcrest Academy, morning arrivals followed a predictable rhythm. Luxury cars lined the circular drive, depositing well-dressed teenagers who moved with the confident swagger that only comes from generational wealth. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the sound of expensive shoes clicking against stone created a symphony of privilege. But on this particular September morning, something different cut through the familiar cadence. The heavy glass doors opened to admit a new figure, a young black woman who walked with quiet determination. Her name was Zara Kane, though few would learn this immediately from any grand introduction or parental escort. Unlike her peers, Zara wore no designer labels. Her simple navy blazer was pressed, but unremarkable, her backpack functional rather than fashionable. What commanded attention wasn't her attire but her bearing. She moved through the hallway with unhurried purpose, neither shrinking from curious stares nor demanding acknowledgement. Each step seemed measured, deliberate. The whispers began almost immediately, spreading like ripples across still water. Students clustered near lockers, their voices carrying fragments of speculation and assumption. Some wondered about scholarships and diversity quotas. Others made crueler observations, their words sharp enough to cut. Zara heard everything. The not-so-subtle comments about her appearance, her presumed background, her place in their exclusive world. But she maintained her steady pace, her expression unchanged. This wasn't her first encounter with such reception, and she had learned long ago that reactions often revealed more about the speaker than the target. Hillcrest Academy wasn't merely a school, it was a carefully curated ecosystem of power and privilege. The children of senators, corporate executives, and old money families walked these halls, preparing for their inevitable ascension to positions of influence. Here, hierarchies weren't just social constructs, but training grounds for adult power structures. At the apex of this teenage aristocracy stood Tyler Brooks, quarterback of the football team, son of a real estate mogul, and possessor of the kind of effortless charisma that made others orbit around him. Tyler had never questioned his position at Hillcrest's summit. It seemed as natural as breathing. He noticed Zara immediately, his athlete's instincts attuned to any shift in his territory's dynamics. Leaning against his locker, surrounded by his usual entourage, Tyler watched her progress down the hallway with calculating eyes. Interesting, he murmured to his companions, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure it would be heard. "New girl thinks she can just waltz in here like she owns the place." His friends responded with the expected laughter, their amusement tinged with anticipation. They recognized the tone. Tyler was sizing up potential prey. As Zara passed their group, Tyler executed what he considered a signature move, a deliberate step into her path, forcing her to navigate around him. It was subtle enough to appear accidental, but obvious enough to establish dominance. Zara simply altered her course without breaking stride, flowing around the obstacle as if it were merely another architectural feature. She didn't acknowledge Tyler with so much as a glance, treating his presence as inconsequential. The dismissal stung more than any verbal retort could have. Tyler was accustomed to reactions, anger, fear, embarrassment, even admiration. But complete indifference? That was new territory, and it left him feeling strangely off balance. "Did she just ignore me?" he asked his friends, his tone mixing disbelief with growing irritation. "Guess she doesn't know who you are yet," one of them replied, though uncertainty colored his voice. Tyler's jaw tightened. At Hillcrest, everyone knew who he was. It was an unwritten law as fundamental as gravity. This new girl's ignorance, or worse, deliberate disregard, couldn't be allowed to stand. In her first class, Zara took a seat near the back, opened her notebook and began writing. Her movements were economical, purposeful. While other students whispered about weekend parties or vacation plans, she focused on the lesson with laser intensity. During breaks, she walked alone. At lunch, she chose a corner table, eating methodically while reviewing notes. She didn't appear lonely or lost, simply self-contained, existing within her own carefully maintained sphere of calm. This isolation might have made her an easy target in most schools. But there was something about Zara's composure that gave potential tormentors pause. She carried herself with a quiet authority that seemed to warn against casual cruelty. Tyler, however, interpreted her solitude differently. To him, it looked like vulnerability masquerading as strength. And if there was one thing he couldn't resist, it was the opportunity to expose such pretenses. The first test came 3 days later. Tyler positioned himself at the intersection of two hallways, timing his movement to create another accidental collision. This time, the impact was harder, designed to knock Zara off balance and perhaps scatter her books. The collision occurred as planned, but Zara's reaction defied expectation. She absorbed the impact with minimal disturbance, quickly gathering her fallen materials, while Tyler offered mock apologies loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "So sorry about that," he said, his tone dripping with false concern. "Guess you're still learning to navigate around here." For the first time, Zara looked directly at him. Her gaze was steady, measuring, completely devoid of the embarrassment or anger Tyler had anticipated. She held his eyes for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to convey that she saw exactly what he was doing, then continued on her way. Those 3 seconds left Tyler feeling strangely unsettled. There had been something in her eyes, a depth of composure that suggested she was operating from reserves of strength he couldn't fathom. It was like staring into still water and realizing you couldn't see the bottom. "That girl's weird," one of his friends muttered as they watched her disappear around a corner. Tyler nodded absently, but privately he was reassessing. Zara Kane wasn't responding according to the established script, and that made her either fascinating or dangerous, possibly both. The escalation was inevitable. At Hillcrest, Tyler's reputation depended on maintaining clear hierarchies, and Zara's continued indifference threatened to undermine his carefully constructed authority. If others saw that someone could simply ignore Tyler Brooks without consequence, the entire social order might begin to crack. The opportunity came during lunch period. The cafeteria buzzed with its usual energy. Designer clothing creating rainbow patterns across expensive furniture, Conversations, mixing gossip with academic anxiety, the subtle displays of wealth that marked every interaction. Zara sat at her customary corner table, a simple meal spread before her, textbook open beside her plate. She ate with the same methodical focus she brought to everything else, occasionally making notes in the margins of her book. Tyler made his entrance with characteristic flair, his entourage trailing behind like a comet's tail. Conversations paused as he passed, heads turning to track his movement. He loved these moments, the palpable shift in atmosphere that his presence created. But today, one person remained unaffected by his arrival. Zara continued eating, continued reading, existing in her bubble of concentration as if Tyler Brooks simply didn't matter. The slight was too public to ignore. Tyler altered his path, steering toward her table with predatory purpose. His friends followed, excitement building as they sensed an impending confrontation. "Mind if we join you?" Tyler asked, though he was already pulling out a chair uninvited. His voice carried across the suddenly quiet cafeteria, drawing dozens of curious eyes. Zara looked up from her book, her expression neutral. "I prefer to eat alone," she said simply, then returned to her reading. The dismissal was so complete, so utterly casual, that for a moment Tyler couldn't process it. Students at Hillcrest didn't refuse Tyler Brooks. They certainly didn't treat him like a minor inconvenience. His friends shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to react to their leader's public rejection. The cafeteria held its collective breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented scenario would unfold. Tyler's face flushed, embarrassment fueling anger. "That's not very friendly," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made several nearby students glance away nervously. "At Hillcrest, we believe in community." "I'm sure you do," Zara replied without looking up. Her tone was perfectly even, neither hostile nor accommodating. "I prefer solitude during meals." The casual dismissal was like gasoline on Tyler's smoldering pride. In one swift motion, he reached across the table and swept her lunch tray aside. Food scattered across the floor, milk splashed against her uniform, and her book fell closed, its place lost. The cafeteria erupted in gasps and nervous laughter. This was the Tyler Brooks they knew, dominant, unpredictable, capable of swift retribution for perceived slights. Zara looked down at the mess, then slowly raised her eyes to meet Tyler's triumphant gaze. What he saw there made his breath catch. No tears, no anger, no humiliation. Just a vast, cold emptiness that seemed to swallow his satisfaction whole. She dabbed at the spill on her uniform with methodical precision, her movements unhurried despite the spectacle Tyler had created. When she finished, she closed her book, placed it carefully in her bag, and stood. The silence in the cafeteria was absolute. Every eye tracked her movement as she walked toward the exit, her posture unchanged, her dignity intact despite Tyler's assault. At the doorway, she paused and looked back. Not at Tyler, but across the room, as if taking inventory of witnesses. Then she was gone, leaving behind a cafeteria full of students who suddenly felt they had witnessed something far more significant than a simple bullying incident. Tyler remained standing beside the empty table, the overturned tray at his feet, waiting for the rush of victory that usually followed such demonstrations of power. Instead, he felt hollow, as if Zara had taken something vital with her when she left. "That showed her," one of his friends said weakly, but the words carried no conviction. Tyler nodded and forced a smile, but privately he was disturbed by what he had seen in Zara's eyes. There had been no defeat there, no acknowledgement of his superiority. If anything, she had looked at him the way one might examine an insect, with detached curiosity rather than fear or anger. That evening, Tyler found himself unable to concentrate on anything. The image of Zara's calm departure replayed endlessly, each iteration making him feel smaller. He had expected tears, pleading, or at least some sign that his actions had affected her. Instead, she had treated his cruelest gesture as a minor inconvenience. Meanwhile, across town, Zara sat at her family's dinner table. The Kane household was a study in understated elegance, expensive but not ostentatious, powerful but quietly so. Her father, Marcus Kane, carved his steak with surgical precision, his movements economical and controlled. Marcus Kane was not a man who needed to announce his importance. His influence moved through the city's corridors of power like a whisper, shaping decisions and outcomes without fanfare. Those who knew him understood that his quiet demeanor masked tremendous capability. "How was school?" he asked without looking up from his plate. "Uneventful," Zara replied, though she could feel his attention sharpen despite his casual posture. Marcus set down his knife and fork, finally meeting his daughter's eyes. Uneventful is a curious word choice for someone whose uniform smells of spilled milk. Zara had changed clothes and showered, but her father's observational skills were legendary. She should have known better than to think she could hide anything from him. "There was a minor incident," she said carefully. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Marcus studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes reading volumes in her careful composure. "Define minor incident." Zara sighed inwardly. Her father's interrogation style was gentle but relentless. "A student thought it would be amusing to knock over my lunch tray. I disagree with his assessment." "And your response?" "I left." Marcus nodded slowly, processing this information. "Restraint is often the most powerful response," he said finally, "but only when backed by the capacity for alternatives." The words carried layers of meaning that Zara understood perfectly. Her father was offering support, but in his own carefully coded way. "I'm aware of my options," she replied. "Good." Marcus returned to his meal, but Zara knew the conversation was far from over. Her father never left loose ends, and Tyler Brooks had just become a very visible loose end. The next morning brought whispers that followed Zara through Hillcrest's halls like a gentle tide. The cafeteria incident had been dissected, analyzed, and mythologized overnight. Some students looked at her with pity, others with curiosity, but many with a newfound wariness that surprised even her. Tyler arrived at school expecting to bask in the aftermath of his victory, but the reaction wasn't what he had anticipated. Instead of congratulations, his friends seemed subdued, almost nervous. Other students who usually sought his attention were keeping their distance. "What's everyone's problem?" he demanded during first period. One of his friends glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "People are asking questions about her," he whispered, "about her family." "What kind of questions?" "Like who they are, where they come from. Someone said her last name is Kane." Tyler felt a chill run down his spine. Kane. The name tickled some half-remembered conversation, some fragment of adult discussion he had overheard but not fully processed. "So," he said, trying to maintain his bravado. His friend's expression grew more troubled. "Tyler, my dad was asking about real estate deals last night, and he mentioned that name, Kane. He said it like it meant something important." The unease that had been building since the cafeteria incident suddenly crystallized into something approaching fear. Tyler began to recall fragments, hushed conversations between his parents, names mentioned in careful tones, discussions that stopped when he entered rooms. By lunchtime, the whispers had evolved into something more substantial. Students huddled in small groups, sharing fragments of information and speculation. The Kane family, they were learning, was not unknown in their city's power circles, quite the opposite. Tyler found himself at the center of increasingly worried conversations. His friends, the same ones who had cheered his dominance just days before, now looked at him with growing concern. "Maybe you should apologize," one suggested hesitantly. "Apologize?" Tyler's voice cracked slightly. For what? Spilling some milk? But even as he said it, he could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. The casual cruelty that had always been his prerogative was suddenly looking less like strength and more like potentially catastrophic error in judgment. As if summoned by his growing anxiety, Zara appeared in the cafeteria doorway. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Conversations died, heads turned, and a path cleared without anyone consciously deciding to move. She walked to her usual table with the same unhurried grace she had always displayed, seemingly oblivious to the attention her presence commanded. But Tyler noticed something different in the way other students looked at her now. The casual dismissal had been replaced by something approaching respect, tinged with wariness. Zara sat, opened her book, and began to eat. She didn't look at Tyler, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. But somehow, her indifference felt more pointed now, more loaded with implications. Tyler's appetite vanished. He pushed his tray away and left the cafeteria, his entourage trailing behind with obvious reluctance. As they walked, he could hear fragments of conversation following in their wake. Heard her father, family connections, wouldn't want to cross them. Each whispered phrase felt like a nail in the coffin of Tyler's certainty. He had built his reputation on knowing exactly where he stood in Hillcrest's hierarchy. But now he was discovering that there were levels of power he hadn't even known existed. That afternoon, Tyler sat in his car in the student parking lot, phone in hand, staring at a number he rarely called. His father was always busy, always in meetings, always managing deals and relationships that Tyler only vaguely understood. But suddenly, those adult complexities seemed directly relevant to his teenage world. The phone rang twice before his father answered. "Tyler, what's wrong?" The concern in his father's voice was immediate, and Tyler realized how rarely he initiated these calls. "Dad, what do you know about the Kane family?" The silence that followed was profound and telling. When his father finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. "Where did you hear that name?" "There's a girl at school." "Tyler." His father's voice was sharp now, urgent. "What girl? What have you done?" The reaction was everything Tyler had feared and more. His father, who commanded respect in business circles across the city, sounded genuinely alarmed. We had a disagreement. It wasn't serious." "Define disagreement." Tyler found himself explaining the cafeteria incident, his words sounding increasingly petty as he described them to his father. When he finished, the silence stretched so long he wondered if the call had been dropped. "Tyler," his father said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "you're going to fix this. Today. Do you understand me?" "Fix what?" "Dad, it was just nothing. It never happened. You're going to apologize, and you're going to mean it. And then you're going to stay as far away from that girl as possible." The urgency in his father's voice sent ice through Tyler's veins. He had never heard him sound frightened before, and the realization that Zara Kane could inspire such fear in a man Tyler had always considered unshakable changed everything. "Who are they?" Tyler whispered. "People you don't want to anger," his father replied. "People whose attention you definitely don't want to attract. Fix this, Tyler. Today." The call ended, leaving Tyler alone in his car with the weight of a revelation he was only beginning to understand. Zara Kane wasn't just the new girl he had decided to torment. She was connected to something larger, something his father, a man who feared very little, was clearly terrified of confronting. As students began filing out of the building, Tyler spotted Zara among them. She walked with the same calm purpose she always displayed, apparently unaware of the storm of speculation swirling around her family name. Tyler started his car but found himself paralyzed by indecision. His father had told him to apologize, But how did one apologize for attempting to humiliate someone who had never shown any sign of being affected? How did he approach someone who might have the power to destroy everything he had taken for granted? Zara reached her own vehicle, a modest sedan that looked almost austere compared to the luxury cars surrounding it, and began loading her backpack. Tyler watched from across the lot, working up the courage to approach, when his phone buzzed with a text message. The number was unfamiliar, but the message was crystal clear. "Your father received good advice. Follow it." Tyler's hands shook as he stared at the screen. No threat, no elaboration, just a simple statement that somehow conveyed more menace than any explicit warning could have managed. He looked up to see Zara driving away, her expression visible through the windshield, as serene as always. She hadn't looked in his direction, hadn't acknowledged him in any way, but somehow Tyler was certain the message had come from her sphere of influence. The game had changed completely. What Tyler had assumed was typical high school dominance posturing had revealed itself as something far more serious, with consequences he was only beginning to comprehend. That night, Tyler lay awake, replaying every interaction he had had with Zara, seeing them now through the lens of his new understanding. Her calm wasn't the resignation of a victim. It was the confidence of someone who had never doubted her ability to handle whatever came her way. Her silence hadn't been weakness. It had been strategy. And now, Tyler Brooks found himself in the unfamiliar position of being the one who needed to be afraid. The following morning transformed Hillcrest Academy's social landscape in ways that would have been unimaginable just a week earlier. Tyler arrived to find his usual circle of friends noticeably smaller, their enthusiasm for his leadership significantly dimmed by whispered conversations with concerned parents. "My dad says I should focus on my studies," one explained awkwardly, avoiding Tyler's eyes. "You know, college applications and all that. Mine thinks I should diversify my friend group," another added, the euphemism failing to mask the underlying message. Tyler watched his power base erode with stunning rapidity. Parents who had once encouraged their children to associate with the Brooks family scion were now quietly suggesting different priorities. Phone calls had been made, conversations held, and subtle pressures applied. Meanwhile, Zara continued her daily routine unchanged. She attended classes, ate lunch alone, walked the halls with the same composed dignity. But now her presence created ripples of awareness that spread through crowds like concentric circles. Students stepped aside without being asked, conversations paused when she passed, and teachers seemed to regard her with a subtle deference that hadn't been there before. Tyler found himself studying her from a distance, trying to understand how someone could wield such influence without apparent effort. She never demanded attention, never flaunted her family's reputation, never even acknowledged the shifting dynamics around her. Yet somehow, her very existence had rewritten Hillcrest's social rules. During third period, Tyler's phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. Consistency matters. Patterns are noticed. The message's implications were clear. His behavior was being monitored, evaluated, judged. Every interaction with Zara, every word he spoke about her, was data being collected and analyzed by forces he couldn't see or comprehend. At lunch, Tyler made his decision. He approached Zara's table with none of his usual swagger, his entourage notably absent. Several students watched the interaction with poorly concealed fascination, sensing the significance of the moment. "Zara," he said, his voice carefully modulated to avoid any hint of his former arrogance. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" She looked up from her book, her expression neutral but attentive. "About what?" "I want to apologize. For the other day, it was inappropriate." The words felt strange in his mouth. Tyler Brooks didn't apologize, didn't admit wrongdoing, didn't acknowledge mistakes. but circumstances had evolved beyond his usual operating parameters. Zara studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes seemingly reading volumes in his carefully controlled expression. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but carried clearly across the suddenly quiet cafeteria. Apology accepted. 2 words, simply delivered, but they carried the weight of clemency from a higher court. Tyler felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, though he remained acutely aware that forgiveness and trust were entirely different propositions. "Thank you," he said, meaning it more than he had expected. "I hope we can start over." Zara nodded once, then returned to her book, effectively dismissing him from her attention. But the dismissal felt different now, less like contempt and more like the natural conclusion of business that had been satisfactorily resolved. Tyler walked away from the encounter, feeling simultaneously relieved and diminished. He had avoided disaster, but at the cost of publicly acknowledging that there were powers at Hillcrest greater than his own. Word of the apology spread through the school with supernatural speed. By the end of the day, everyone knew that Tyler Brooks had bent the knee to the quiet new girl who had somehow transformed their carefully ordered world. Some students found vindication in Tyler's comeuppance, having suffered under his casual cruelties for years. Others were simply amazed at the demonstration of influence without obvious effort. But all of them understood that the rules had changed permanently. Tyler's former friends began gravitating toward other social centers, sensing that association with him no longer carried the benefits it once had. His carefully maintained reputation for untouchability had been shattered, replaced by the knowledge that he, like everyone else, was subject to larger forces. In the weeks that followed, Hillcrest settled into its new equilibrium. Zara remained an enigma, neither seeking popularity nor avoiding it, existing in her own carefully maintained sphere of purpose and focus. She answered questions in class with thoughtful precision, participated in group projects with quiet competence, and gradually became part of the school's fabric without ever compromising her essential nature. Tyler, meanwhile, discovered what life was like without the automatic deference he had always taken for granted. He wasn't ostracized or humiliated, that would have been beneath Zara's notice, but he was no longer the unchallenged arbiter of Hillcrest's social order. Some might have called it a fall from grace, but Tyler began to recognize it as something else entirely, an education in the difference between authority and power, between reputation and respect, between fear and influence. Zara Kane had taught him these distinctions without ever raising her voice, making a threat, or even acknowledging that a lesson was being delivered. She had simply existed with quiet confidence, allowing her authentic strength to speak louder than any demonstration of force could have managed. As autumn progressed into winter, Tyler found himself observing Zara with something approaching admiration. She had faced his worst behavior with unshakable composure, responded to his cruelty with dignity, and ultimately transformed their entire social environment through nothing more complex than being genuinely herself. It was, he realized, the most effective demonstration of power he had ever witnessed. The realization that followed was even more profound. Real strength didn't need to prove itself through dominance over others. It simply existed, quiet and unassailable, requiring no validation from external sources. Tyler Brooks had learned many things during his years at Hillcrest Academy, but none more valuable than the lesson Zara Kane had taught him about the difference between being feared and being respected, between demanding submission and inspiring genuine regard. In the end, she had given him something far more valuable than the shallow popularity he had lost. She had shown him what authentic strength actually looked like. And perhaps, Tyler thought, as he watched her walking across campus with her usual composed grace, that was the most generous gift he had ever received, even if he hadn't deserved it. Winter gave way to spring at Hillcrest Academy, and with the changing seasons came a subtle but unmistakable shift in the school's social ecosystem. Zara Kane had become an established presence, neither celebrated nor marginalized, but simply accepted as part of the institution's complex hierarchy. Her influence operated like gravity, invisible but undeniable, shaping interactions and relationships without requiring conscious acknowledgement. Students who had once participated in casual cruelties found themselves choosing kindness instead, not from fear, but from a growing awareness that such behavior was simply beneath their better selves. Tyler had learned to navigate this new environment with surprising grace. His leadership style evolved from dominance to collaboration. His humor shifted from mockery to genuine wit, and his relationships deepened beyond the shallow alliances of convenience that had previously defined his social circle. He never became friends with Zara. Their interaction remained politely distant. But he developed a profound respect for the way she had transformed their shared world without ever seeming to try. Years later, when Tyler looked back on his time at Hillcrest Academy, he would remember the semester Zara Kane arrived as the period when he learned the most important lesson of his life: that true power lies not in the ability to diminish others, but in the strength to remain yourself regardless of external pressures. Zara had taught him this through example rather than instruction, through presence rather than preaching, through the simple but revolutionary act of refusing to let others define her worth. In a world obsessed with dominance and submission, she had chosen dignity. In an environment that rewarded aggression, she had demonstrated the greater strength of composure. In a place where status was everything, she had shown that character mattered more. The lesson had cost Tyler his comfortable position at Hillcrest's apex, but it had given him something far more valuable: the understanding that genuine respect must be earned rather than demanded, and that the most lasting influence comes not from fear, but from the inspiration of seeing someone live according to their principles, regardless of the consequences. As graduation approached and their paths diverged toward different futures, Tyler carried with him the memory of Zara's unwavering composure in the face of his worst behavior. She had never needed to defeat him, because she had never seen him as an enemy worthy of her energy. Instead, she had simply been herself, completely, authentically, unapologetically herself. And in doing so, had created space for everyone around her to become better versions of themselves as well. It was, Tyler realized, the most elegant victory he had ever witnessed, one that transformed opponents into students, conflict into growth, and animosity into understanding. Zara Kane had won their confrontation not by conquering, but by transcending, not by fighting, but by refusing to recognize that a fight was necessary. And in learning to see the world through her eyes, Tyler Brooks had discovered something he never would have found on his own: the quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and never apologizing for it.